Masechet Baba Kama Daf Kaf Aleph. We're in the middle of the sugya of Zen Hene Veze Lo Chaser. If I go and squat in your courtyard and stay there, I get benefit, especially if I don't have any place, other place to live, and I would otherwise have to pay. But it's a case where you do not lose out. You were not going to rent out that space anyway, so it was going to stay empty no matter what. Do I have to pay you rent or not? So we saw that there are different opinions about this, and we continue. Shelach le Rabbi Abba bar Zavda lemare bar Mor be'amine merav huna. So the Rabbi Abba sent a message to Mari bar Mad and said, "Listen, you're traveling and you're going to go see Rav Huna. You're going to his city. Would you mind asking him when you get there the following question on my behalf?" Hadar b'chasar chavero shelo mida'ato tzarich la'alot lo sachar o lo. Can you ask him if someone lives in the courtyard of someone else without his knowledge, the knowledge of the person of the one who owns the courtyard, does the squatter have to pay rent or not? Adachi nach nafshed Rav Huna. But by the time Mari bar Mor got there, Rav Huna had already died, and so he couldn't ask him the question. Amar le Rabba bar Rav Huna. Hachi amar Rabba mori mishemeh derav. But even though he died, his son, Rav Huna's son, Rabba, said, "My father taught me this before he died, in the name of Rav." Eno sarich la'alot lo sachar v'socher bayit me'orven ma'aleh sachar l'shimon. He said, no, a squatter does not have to pay rent. But if someone rents a house from Reuven, he has to pay rent to Shimon. Okay, now the first one is clear, got it. He doesn't have to pay rent. But the second line is very strange. What does it mean he has to? First of all, why does he have to pay rent? And why is he paying rent to Shimon and not Reuven? So Shimon, my avidite, what is Shimon doing here? Why do I have to pay Shimon? Hachi kamar nimsa bait Shimon ma'aleh lo sachar. It means as follows: I thought I was renting a house from Reuven. I thought he was the owner, but it turns out it's wrong. Actually, Shimon is the owner. Then I have to pay the rent to Shimon. Okay, now we know what Shimon is doing here, but this seems to be contradictory. Tarteh, we ask. The first you said that if I'm squatting somewhere, I don't have to pay. And then you say, well, if I got the wrong owner and it turns out the other owner, then I do have to pay. Well, if I'm still a squatter, what's the difference who the owner is, right? Really, if I'm not paying one, why would I have to pay anybody? And the answer is had kaima le'agra, had la kaima le'agra. The two halves of the Rav Huna's statement in the name of Rav are talking about two different cases. The second case where it says, I thought I was renting it from Reuven. Turns out now I found out Shimon is the real owner, and that apartment is for rent. So I have to pay because it is for rent. And if I'm staying there, that means a next person is not going to be able to stay there. Shimon has to turn away paying customers because I'm there. So therefore, that is zen hene v'zeh chaser, in which case, obviously, I have to pay. Whereas the first case is where I'm staying there and he doesn't know about it, and it's not for rent. It's not for rent anyway, and therefore I'm staying on your property. We weren't going to rent it out no matter what, and therefore I do not have to pay. That's all one version. So some say the following statement in the name of Rav. Some say in this name of Rav Huna. In fact, it's probably both, because as we just saw before, Rav Huna was a student of Rav, and Rav Huna said it in the name of Rav. So here it's either being quoted directly from Rabbi Chia bar Avin in the name of Rav, or to be Chia bar Rabbi in the name of Rav Huna, who probably in fact got it from Rav. But there's just two ways of remembering the names. It says, Hadar b'chasar chavero shelo mida'ato eno serich la'alot lo sachar. The same exactly as what we had before. If I'm living in your courtyard without your knowledge, I do not have to pay you rent. Hasocher bait mi b'nei ha'ir ma'aleh sachar le'be'alim. However, if I'm staying in a house, if I'm renting a house from the community, from the residents of a city, I have to pay the owner. Now, this is curious. What does that mean? I'm renting from the city, people of the city, but I have to pay the owner? Like what's the disjunction here? Ba'alim, my avidatayu. What do you mean the owner? I mean, if it's from the people of the city, that sounds like maybe there is no owner. So hachikama nimsulo be'alim ma'alin lahen sachar. If they find out who the owner is, then I have to pay. It sounds like it's a case where there's some property and it's been abandoned, seemingly abandoned, and so there is no owner, and therefore I'm renting it just from the residents of the city. Well, that's why I don't have to pay anything, because it's not for rent. And nobody's staying there no matter what. It's just an abandoned property. And so I just go to the owners of the city. I'm like, hey, anybody sleeping here? All right, I'll sleep here. And therefore, I would not have to pay. But if we find out that it actually belongs to an owner, the owner comes around and says, wait, that's my property, right? Oh, I don't want people sleeping there. I'm going to rent it out. So then I have to pay. That's exactly what we clarify here. Tarteh, it seems like there's a contradiction. On the first he said, if I'm squatting in someone's property without them knowing, I don't have to pay, but then it says I do have to pay. And the difference is, the second part one is talking about where it's going to be rented. The owner wants to rent it, so therefore I have to pay. Whereas the first statement where he says you don't have to pay, that's where it was not going to be rented anyway. So that's ze nehene veze lo chaser. So you see, the first version and second version are really the same. Just this says in the name of Reuven and Shimon, and this says it in the name of the people of the city and the owner. But probably these are overlapping and describing the same case. This one is a little bit clearer because this one doesn't say who Reuven and Shimon are. But from this second version, we have a better sense of what his Rav Huna or Nav's original meaning was. He's contrasting a case where. Contrasting between a case where I'm squatting without the owner's knowledge and it's not going to be rented out, so I don't have to pay, and between a case where that can turn into, well, right now it's not, but he's not the real owner, and so the real owner comes and says, wait, it is mine, and I do want to rent it out, and then I have to pay. Amar Rav Sechora, Amar Rav Huna, Amar Rav. Another statement in the name of Rav Huna, in the name of his teacher Rav. Hadar b'chasad chavelo shelo midato en sarich la'alot lo sachar mishum shene'emar ush'iya yukat sha'ar. Here's the same law that if I'm squatting in your house, in your courtyard, without your knowledge, I do not have to pay. But now we're adding a reason. Because of a pasuk in Yeshaya that says, a gate is stricken into ruin. The beginning of the pasuk says, desolation remains in the city and the gate is stricken into ruin. In other words, when something is left desolate, it ends up falling apart. We see this in our own life, in our own experience. If you leave a house empty for a year, you come back, you think it should be exactly the same as it was. But instead, there's dirt all over the place and cobwebs and everything starts breaking. And, it's weird, but somehow leaving something empty is not really good for it. And therefore, actually, the squatter is doing something good for the owner. By squatting there and staying there, he's not leaving it empty. If it would be empty, then it would break apart. And there are, all kinds of problems. A lot of people actually, like to have a house sitter. They might even hire a house sitter if you're going to be away for a long time. That will make sure things don't go wrong. There's a fire, a flood. Things break and then they won't break further. There's someone there, and just having someone there is good for a house. And that's why a squatter does not have to pay, because a squatter is actually benefiting the owner. Amar Rav Ashe ledidi chazile umnagach ki Torah. Rav Ashe says, I've seen the damage that happens when something is left empty, this she'iyah damage, and it's like an ox goring. It's like really bad. The Rashi here says that she'iyah is the name of a demon that takes over a house that's empty, but there's no reason to go there. This is just talking about neither natural settling of the house and deterioration, or it could be worms and insects or animals that go and cause damage to the house. And when there's no one living there, then they just take over, and there's no one to take care of it. Rav Yosef Amar Beta Miyateba Yateb. Rav Yosef, along the same line, says a folk saying, house that is lived in will be safeguarded, will be settled. If you settle a house, it will be settled, right? It's good for a house for it to be there. Therefore, if anything, then maybe the squatter can say, "You pay me. I'm guarding your house for you." Okay, of course, that he doesn't have to pay. The owner doesn't have to pay the squatter. But the point is that the squatter says, "Listen, you weren't going to rent it out anyway." And I'm saying here, yeah, I deserve to have rent free because I'm helping to preserve your house. My benayu. What's the difference between the statement that Rav said and Rav Yosef said? Ika benayu dekamishamesh be besibe v'tibna. The difference would be if the homeowner is storing wood and straw in that area, in that courtyard, or in that house, because according to Rav, it's bad for it to be deserted. But as long as there's something in it, then it will be preserved. So as long as there's stuff in it, even if it's used just as a warehouse or as a storage facility, still that will be kept okay. And I don't need the squatter. So the squatter cannot say, I'm helping you. If it's being used at least for something, for storage, then the squatter cannot get away with rent-free. But according to Rav Yosef, it has to be miyat, it has to be actually lived in order for it to be protected. And so the storing wood and straw is not going to protect it. And so therefore the squatter who comes, even if it's used for storage, the squatter can say, I'm helping you protect it. And therefore I don't have to pay rent. A story about a person that went to a garbage heap belonging to orphans. Not literally that it's full of garbage. It just means it's an empty lot, and the people just throw garbage in it, and no one empties it out. It's an abandoned field. It does belong to orphans, but they're not doing anything with it for a long time. So this guy comes along and builds a nice big mansion on this land. Rav Nachman, as a judge, went and confiscated this mansion and said, you can't have this, you have to pay the orphans. You're not paying rent, you're not paying them for the right to build over here. So he took the mansion. Now, it seems that Rav Nachman thinks that if I live in your courtyard or without your knowledge, that I do have to pay. And this guy who built the mansion, he is using the courtyard of the orphans without their agreement, and so he has to pay. And that's why he took away his mansion until he pays. Right? Doesn't that sound right? So one has to pay according to Rav Nachman. And the answer is not necessarily. No, it's actually talking about a case where there were certain people, the Carmanians. This was some nomadic people, and they would sit and settle in some place and go place to place. And they were paying the orphans a little bit of money to be sitting in this dump, in this empty lot. So although they were paying way below market value, but they're paying something. And now this guy came and built a palace on it. Okay, that's nice for him, but he kicked out these nomads. And now the orphans are getting zero. So Rav Nachman said, listen, you did cause them a loss. Fine, if you don't want to pay the whole amount of the rental for having putting your palace over here, that's fine, because really Rav Nachman may very well think that zenene v'zeh lo haser would be patur. So he's not asking him to pay for the entire amount, but for the loss that the orphans actually did have, even the small loss of these nomads not paying, Rav Nachman said, go and pay. And the guy didn't pay attention, he didn't pay. So Rav Nachman said, okay, I'm going to confiscate your mansion, right? Because you're not even paying the minimal amount that you definitely owe, because that's something that you did cause a loss to the orphans. And that closes out this topic of zenene v'zeh lo chaser. We go back to the Mishnah. Here, I'm going to open the Mishnah here. It says, in what case do you pay for that which it benefited from? Meaning, what's the distinction between my animal paying benefiting in the Reshut Harabim versus in your property? If it's in the Reshut Harabim, then I only have to pay a minimal amount of what my animal benefited from, in terms of the calories of grain. But if it's in your property, then I have to pay full amount of damages. So where's the cutoff line? And it gives two examples. That if my animal's eating in the middle of the street, that's a Reshut Harabim, then I only have to pay that which it benefited from. But if it's on the sides of the street, now the sides of the street technically are not private property. We're talking about like a sidewalk, even though they're not private property, but it's not really a public thoroughfare. Animals don't usually go on a sidewalk. And therefore, if you have some food that you put on the sidewalk, you expect it to be protected, and therefore the sidewalk is considered the same as private property, and I have to pay the full amount. Similarly, gives a second example of a marketplace where things that are in the front of the marketplace, that's where everybody goes back and forth, and animals too, and therefore I have to pay only what it benefited from. But if it goes into your store, that's already your property, and I have to pay the full damages. That would be chatzer hanizak. Okay, that's what the Mishnah said. Now we're going to elaborate on that. Rav says that when you have to pay the full amount, that's not only when my animal goes fully into your property and eats something on your food on your property, even if it's in the public domain, but it turns its head. Mechazeret means it turns its head and reaches and eats something on the side of the road. All that would also be liable. Not only when it's fully on the side of the road. In other words, we follow where the food is, even though the animal is in the Shut Harabim, but it's reaching its head, turning to the side. That's considered the side of the road and private property, and I have to pay full damages. So Rav is machmir. Shmuel amar afilu machazeret name patur, whereas Shmuel says no. If my animal is currently in the middle of the street, even if it turns its head and reaches over and eats something from the sidewalk, still it's patur, because we're going to look at where the animal currently is. And it's in the Shut Harabim. If I'm the owner of the animal, I could say, well, my animal has a right to walk in the middle of the street. Yeah, it's going to turn its head this way and that way. That's just it's normal activity. It's still in the middle of the street. And therefore, I am patur from paying full damages. I have to pay only hana'ah. Okay. We ask, according to Shmuel, even if I turn my head and eat from the side of the street, I don't have to pay. So according to Shmuel, in what case would I have to pay? That would be considered in the in the examples of this Mishnah. If you want to make some distinction between the middle of the road and the side of the road. What Shmuel would say in a case where the animal leaves the middle of the street and goes and stands all the way on the sidewalk, and animal starts walking on the sidewalk and eats from your produce that's on the sidewalk, then it's liable, because the whole animal is in a place that is used as private domain. So that's my problem. I can't let it do that. It's not normal for an animal to walk over there on the side. That's going into your domain, and therefore that would be a category of shen. But as long as the animal is within the middle of the street, that's in public domain. And just because it turns its head doesn't remove it from public domain. So that's Shmuel's understanding. Now, this discussion that we just said, which was presented as a commentary on the Mishnah, we have a parallel discussion, which ends up basically in the same place. But this one is a standalone statement, meaning in this version, they didn't say it as a limitation on the Mishnah, but rather they were just saying independent halacha. Mahazeret, Rav Amar, Hayevet. Rav says if an animal is in the middle of the street and it turns its head to the side of the road, then the owner of the animal has to pay full amount because the side of the road where it's eating is like private domain. Ushmuel Amar Petura. Shmuel says not true. As long as the animal's in the middle of the road, even if it turns its head, we follow where the whole animal is, and it's in the Shut Harabim, and therefore Shen and the Shut Harabim do not have to pay damages. Now, according to Shmuel, when we say, and now we are quoting the Mishnah, that one has to pay full damage, what case would that be? That you have to pay full damage. I mean, obviously, if it walks into your field and eats, it's going to have to pay. But we want to know a case that would fit with the examples of the Mishnah, where there's some distinction between the middle of the road and the side of the road. And his answer, as before, if it left the middle of the road and the whole animal went and stood at the side of the road and ate from your produce there, that would be shen in an area that's used as reshut hayachid, and therefore I would be liable to full damages. Mativ Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak. Rav Nachman has a challenge to Rav. מפתח החנות משלמת מה שנהנית, הכי משכחת לה. When in the second example of the Mishnah, remember the Mishnah talked about the thing between the middle and sides of the Reshut Harabim, but then it made another distinction between in the marketplace, the wares that are in the front of the store versus those that are inside the store. So when it says that when an animal eats from that wares in front of the store, he only has to pay that which it benefited from, and not the full damages. What would the case be? Peshita b'machazeret v'kamar mor mashenenit in mahashezika la. This would have to be a case where it turned its head. Think of the shuk Machane Yehuda, where you have these stalls, and throughout the all the way up and down the shuk, there are presentations of fruits and baskets of fruits and vegetables, all outside. So in order for an animal to possibly, that's walking through, to possibly eat from it, it would definitely have to turn its head. And I've said, if it turns its head and eats, even if it's in the middle, it nevertheless is chayav, means it has to pay damages. So it sounds like in all cases, in a marketplace, the owner of the animal would have to pay full damages. How could you ever have a case where doesn't have to turn its head? It's just straight. It's just walking straight in the middle of the path, and it could possibly eat something. In which case, you would say that you pay only that which it benefits from. How would you ever have such a case that it's not turning its head? And the answer, hu motiv la v'hu mefarek la. Juan asked the question, and he also figured out an answer. That kaima bekeren zavit, where it's on a corner. So if you imagine, let's say there's a stall here where these tomatoes are, and the animals, let's say it's walking from this way, and now it's turning a corner. As it's turning a corner, it's at some point at a 45-degree angle, and these tomatoes are going to be straight in front of it. It would not have to turn its head. It would just eat them there at that point. Since that is in the middle of the thoroughfare, now technically it's on the side because there's a wall here and a store inside. So this is on the side of the Reshut Harabim if you're walking this way. But if you're walking this way, then you end up hitting it right in front of you, and therefore this is a way that an animal would be able to eat without turning its head, and that would be the case of the Mishnah, where the owner has to pay only that which the animal benefits from, and not full nizikin. All that was only one version of the machloket between Rav and Shemuel. Ika de amere, but there's a second version. Mehazeret kula amala peligi de hayevet. In fact, everyone agrees, Rav and Shemuel agree, that if it turns its head and eats something from the side of the road, then that is liable because the food is on the side of the road. And so that's called Reshut HaNizak. Ki pelige b'makseh makom mershuto leReshut Harabim. Rather, where the machloket between Rav and Shemuel is a case where someone takes some of his own private property and he gives it up for the public domain. In other words, he puts his fence, he moves it, technically his property goes up to this certain point, but he moves his fence inside into his property a couple of feet, and then there's the space there where everyone's going to walk. Animals are going to walk because it's outside the fence, even though technically it's his private property. And so this is as an unusual case of something that would normally be used and animals would walk there, even though it's technically private property. What are we going to do with that? Hachik itemar, and this is what the machloket is. Amarav lo shanu ela mahazeret aval makseh makom ershuto l'shut harabim petura. Rav says, when do we say that an animal is the owner of the animal is liable to pay a full amount of damages? That's if it's walking and it turns its head and eats something from the side of the road, then one has to pay. But if it's walking in an area that belongs to that's privately owned, that he privately owned, that he left over to be the Reshut Harabim, he took from his own private property to make a Reshut Harabim, then the owner does not have to pay, because even though technically it's private property, but it's used as public domain, and therefore you can't expect me to stop my animal from walking there if it's outside of a fence, and so I don't have to pay. Shmuel amar afilu makseh makom reshuto reshut harabim hayevet. And Shmuel says not only turning one's head, if the animal turns its head, I have to pay full amount, but also in this case, if it's in this private property that is being used as public property, we consider it private property. It is yours, and therefore my animal's eating from reshut hanizak, and I have to pay. That's the machloket. It's in such a case, not in the case of machzeret. Now, lema bebor b'shuto kami palge. It seems that this machloket between Rav and Shemuel would match up with a machloket Tanaim that we're going to see later on in the Masechet regarding a pit that is in my domain. Let's say I dig a pit in my field. I'm allowed to dig a pit in my field. It's my field. I could do what I want. But then I make it hefker. I say this field, it's not mine. Anybody can come and go in it. Now, am I liable or not? That's a machloket. Some say that I'm not liable because it was mine. It was my field when I made the pit, so it's okay. And others say, yeah, but I made it hefker, and now everybody's going to come and walk there, and I made something dangerous in a place that's going to be used by the public, and so I am liable. Okay, so it seemed that we can match up these opinions. Maybe Rav Damar Patur Kasavar Bor Birshuto Hayav. Rav, who says that if my animal eats something from this area that used to be yours, that you said anyone can go and use it, so that's the same as the Reshut Hayachid that was made hefker. And the Rav says that if my animal eats from that area, it's patur, meaning it's considered like Reshut Harabim. So the equivalent of that would be that if you dug a pit there and then you made it hefker, so still that's considered Reshut Harabim. And if you dig a pit in Reshut Harabim, then you are liable. So the same reasoning that would make you liable if you dig a pit in your field and make it hefker would make me not liable if I ate produce that's in that section of the field, because since you made it Reshut Harabim, it's Reshut Harabim, and Shen is patur in Reshut Harabim. And on the other hand, Shmuel damar hayav kasabar bor b'shuto patur. Shmuel said that if my animal eats in this area, since you owned it, even though you're letting people walk there, but still is your property, you're responsible, and you're responsible for it, and you can put things there, you have a right to put your food there, and so even though people are walking there, still is your property, and therefore, according to Shemuel, that my animal that eats there, that's Shen, B'shut HaNizak, and I have to pay. For the same reason, if you dig a pit there, even though you said, okay, anyone can come and walk here, nevertheless, it's still considered your property, and therefore the pit, if someone falls into it, patur. This is your property, both for the pit, so that you're not responsible for animals that come into your property and fall into your pit. You can make a pit in your property, and the food there and the animals that walk there also is considered your property, the Reshut HaNizak. And if my animal eats something from there, I have to pay Shen in the Reshut HaNizak. So it seems that this can line up. Now we don't really want it to line up because we'd rather that all Amoraim can be reconciled with either or of each of the Tanaitic opinions. And so we say now, not necessarily. Amar lach Rav, leolam malach be'alma bor b'shuto patur. בשנה אחת אמר, לאו כל כמנח דמקרבת להו לפירותך, לרשות הרבים, ומחייבת להו לתוראי. Rav could say that in general I agree that a pit in this type of property that was mine and then I gave it away, I'm still not liable for it because it's still considered my property. I'm still responsible for it, and it's still mine, and therefore so your animal came into my property and fell into my pit. It's my pit. I'm not liable. So in general, we consider this area to be mine, even if I made it hefker, and therefore that should be the same. The same should be true regarding Shen, that it should be called the Reshut HaNizak, and therefore you should be liable. However, Rav says there's an overriding argument, because the owner of the animal can say to the owner of this piece of the field that he moved the fence in and gave it away, he says it's not within your power to bring your produce close to the Shut Harabim and make me liable to pay for my ox harming it. Right? In other words, you're putting really a stumbling block. You're making something a very difficult situation by moving your fence in and making this part of a thoroughfare where animals are going to go. And now, if animals are going to go there, then it's likely they're going to eat there. So if you're treating it like a public thoroughfare, then it should also have the laws of a public thoroughfare when it comes to produce. Okay, you're right. For in terms of a pit, it's yours, it's fine. But in terms of produce, where it's right there and the animals are going to come and eat it, because just naturally it's in its way, therefore you have to treat it like Reshut Rabim and Ayam Patur. This is like when stores put candy and right at the exit of the store, low down, so that kids go and take it, and before their parents can realize, and then they get accused for shoplifting. Right? Don't put stuff there low down where kids are going to take it right at the exit, and then say it's my fault. Don't put your fruit here. Right in the middle of a place that is now being used as a public thoroughfare because you moved your fenced in and allowed everybody to go and walk there. So that's Rav. Ushmuel amar be'alma bor b'shuto hayav. Shmuel could say, listen, in general, I think that if I made a pit in my field and then I made it hefker, once I make it hefker, and now everybody's going to walk there, I am liable if someone falls into the pit. So we consider this place to be the Shut Harabim. Now regarding a board, fine, that makes sense, because you walking there had no idea that there's a pit there and you fell in. That's why I'm responsible. But for fruit there, you're walking your animals there, can you say, oh, we didn't see the fruit? It's right there. You can see it. So avoid it, right? It's my property. Technically, it's my property. And so even though I move my fence in and people are walking back and forth, you have to see and say, oh, well, that's behind the property line. I better make sure to avoid that. You can avoid a fruit stand. It's harder for an animal to avoid a pit. And so we see that the Rav and Shmuel could explain themselves according to either side of the Bor B'Shut Harabim, either way. Bor B'Shuto, whatever they say about that machloket, Rav and Shmuel can explain themselves. Okay, now we go back to the animal turning its head. Even though we explained Rav and Shmuel not according to that, we're going back to that explanation. And we say, Lema mechazeret tana'ehi, the machloket that we saw earlier between Rav and Shmuel about whether one is liable if the animal turns its head, is actually parallel to a machloket between two Tanaim. When the animal is in the middle of the Shut Harabim and turns its head to the side and eats something, that produce that's on the side of it, is one liable or not? Well, let's see. This Baraita says, the Tanya, Achla mitoch harchava meshalemet ma shenehenit. So these first two Tanaim say that if it eats from the middle of the street, then you only pay what it benefited, because that's a Shut Harabim. And if it seems that we're talking about that if it moved to the side of the street and ate from the side of the street, then that's considered the private domain, because even though it's in the public domain, it's a sidewalk where people normally put their produce, and because animals don't usually walk there. And so if my animal goes and eats over there, that's the same as a Shut HaNizak, and I would have to pay the full amount. That's the first two opinions. Whereas Rabbi Yosef and Rabbi Elazar say, no, it's not the way of an animal to walk, to eat while it's walking. Rather, it goes and walks. It's unusual for it to go and move to the side of the road, and therefore, well, it seems like he's saying the same thing. Rabbi Yosef, Hainu Tanakama. That's what we followed up with the question, right? Exactly, that's what we meant. It is unusual for an animal to go walk on the side of the road. That's precisely why the side of the road has a different law than the middle of the road. In the middle of the road, that's normally where it goes and walks and is going to eat things, and therefore, that's a Shut Harabim. I have a right to bring my animal. Don't put your produce there. That's why I'm not liable for hezek there. But on the side of the road where it's unusual for animals to walk and eat, there you're allowed to put your produce there, and you can expect my animal not to walk there. That's why I am liable to damages. So if with our initial understanding, Rabbi Yosef is saying the same thing as the first two opinions. So that can't be. Ela mechazeret ika benaihu. Tana kama sabar mechazeret nami meshalem ma shenehenet. Rabbi Yosef sabar meshalemet ma shehezika. Therefore, must be that they're arguing about where the animal is walking in the middle of the road and turns its head to the side of the road and eats it. That's the difference between the first two Tanaim and the second two. The first two Tanaim think that if an animal turns its head, then I also have to pay that which it benefits from. So that's what it means here. When it eats from the middle of the road, then it only has to pay what it benefits from, because turning its head, you go by where the body of the animal is, it's walking in the middle of the road, and that's normal for it to walk. And so what? It turns its head, right? Still in the middle of the road, and therefore only has to pay that which it benefited from. That's unlike if it moves to the side of the road, then you have to pay the full amount. That's the first opinion. And to that, Rabbi Yosef says, no, you have to pay. If it's in the middle of the road and turns to the side, you still have to pay the full amount, because this is unusual. When an animal is walking in the middle of the street, it's supposed to just walk. It's unusual for it to turn its head. And therefore, the owner of the produce is not expecting animals in the middle of the road to turn their heads and stretch out their necks and eat from the side of the road. That's so since they have a right to use the side of the road and put their produce there, because there's no reason to think that animals are going to think that are going to turn their heads. So just like animals don't usually walk on the side of the road, they also don't usually walk in the middle of the road and turn their heads to eat. And therefore, in both of these cases, if my animal goes and does that, I have to pay the full amount. And so it looks like from here that the Tanakama and the first two opinions and last two opinions are arguing about whether one is not liable when it turns its head. That's the first two opinions, or I am liable when it turns its head and eats from the side of the road. And that would line up with the initial understanding of the machlokah between Rav and Shemuel. So now we say, no, la dekula alma la mechazeret ikerav Shemuel. In fact, all these Tanaim can agree either with Rav or with Shemuel. It doesn't matter. And because we're not talking about a case of the animal turning its head. Rather, these two sets of Tanaim are arguing about the interpretation of what this means, that when the Pasuk says, if my animal goes and consumes in someone else's field, how exactly do you understand that? Mor Sabad, that's Rabbi Meir, the first two opinions, or say it means, the owner of the animal is liable only if it eats in the domain of the Nizak, or in the sides of the Reshut Harabim, are also like the domain of the Nizak. But in the Reshut Harabim, one is never liable according to the first two opinions. However, the second two opinions of Yosef, when it says that I'm liable when my animal eats in someone else's field, that includes public domain also. I am liable. The only thing it excludes is my own field. Right? I'm the owner of the animal that ate, and it's in my own field. You came, and without my permission, you put food in my field, and my animal goes and eats it. Well, who asked you to put food in my field? That's where I am not liable. But in all other cases, both in your field and in the Reshut Harabim, according to the Biyoseh, I am liable for my animal eating in Reshut Harabim. Now we ask, Reshut HaMazik? Wait a second. This pasuk is coming to tell me, to teach us that if you put food in my field, I am not liable. Lema perach b'reshuti my ba'eh. That's obvious. I can tell you, who asked you to put your produce in my field? I don't have to pay you for that. So pasuk wouldn't have to talk about that case. Ela de'ilfa v'de'bioshaya ika benayu. Rather, the difference between the first two opinions, the second two opinions in the Baraita, revolves around the cases of Ilfa and Rabbi Oshaya, where my animal is walking and stretched out its neck and ate from the sack of grain that's on your animal. Or it lifted up its front feet and went and ate from the sack on the back of your animal in the public thoroughfare. According to the first two Tanaim, the Pasuk says you only have to pay in the Reshut HaNizak. That excludes all cases of Reshut Harabim. Even those cases where my animal eats from the sack on your animal, if it's in Shut HaRabim, I don't have to pay, never have to pay. But according to Rabbi Yosef, the second two opinions in the Baraita, I would have to pay, even in the Shut HaRabim. If my animal goes and eats from the sack of your animal, that's considered like a Reshut HaNizak also, and I would have to pay in that case. But still, I would not have to pay. Of course, if you put food in my animal, I would not have to pay. That's Shut HaMazik. And also, a regular Shut HaRabim case, that's also called Meshut HaMazik, because some thoroughfare, my animal's allowed to walk in it, and so I don't have to pay in a place where my animal can walk. Yes, that's true. But if it goes into the sack on your animal, then that's also included in the Shut HaNizak, and that case is the difference between the first two and second two opinions of the Baraita. The next Mishnah teaches, "Hakelev hagedish kafsu merosh hagag v'shaburot hakelim meshalem nezik shalem mipnei shehen mu'adin." If my dog or my goat goes and climbs up and jumps off a roof and breaks your vessels that are down at the bottom, I have to pay a full amount of damages because these animals are forewarned. It's known that this is a normal thing for an animal to do, to go and jump off roofs. These dogs and goats do that. And therefore, if it's mine, I have to make sure it doesn't climb up and put itself in that situation. And if it does, that means I am negligent, I didn't watch it, and I am liable for any damage it does. Second case, הכלב שנטל חררה וחלך לגדיש, הלכה לחררה והדליק הגדיש, על החררה משלם נזק שלם ועל הגדיש משלם חצי נזק. If my dog goes and takes a pita bread from on top of your coals, and there's a coal attached to it also, and then it takes it and goes to your stack of grain. It eats the entire pita bread, and the coal ends up on the stack of grain and burns it down. I have to pay you the full amount for the pita bread because that's shen. That's a normal thing that it does. But for the pita bread, that's for the pita bread. But for the grain, this is unusual that it took this coal and threw it there. It's an unusual act, and therefore it's never did this before. It's a kelev tam. And I only have to pay half amount of chatzi nezek for goring, which because this is also an unusual activity. Good. Let's focus on the first one. Tama de kafsu hanaflu patur alma kasaba techilato bepishia v'sofo beones patur. See, I only have to pay if my dog jumps off, because it's normal. Dogs and goats jump off things, and therefore I am forewarned and I have to pay. But let's say they went up on top of there and they slipped and fell and fell down off the roof and then broke things on the way down or broke something on the floor. Then I do not have to pay because that's honest. And so it's beyond my control. It's just a total accident. Therefore, you see, there seems to be a difference between something that's a total accident and something that's unusual activity like goring. Goring it's not the animals doing it by accident when it gores someone. It's not normal behavior, but it does do it sometimes. It's not an accident. Here, it just slipped and fell. That's a total accident. At least that's how we're understanding it now. Therefore, I am patur. Now, we can derive from here that even though at the beginning I'm negligent because I shouldn't have let it go up there. I should have known if it goes up to the roof, it's going to jump off, it's going to break something. And so I was negligent to allow it to go up. Nevertheless, it didn't actually jump, it fell. And so it was an accident. Therefore, I am patur, even though I was negligent at the beginning. Okay, Tanya Nameh Hachi. We have a Baraita that supports this interpretation. Naflu peturin. It says exactly the same thing. The dog and the goat that jumped from the roof and broke something, I have to pay. But if it just fell on its own, then it's not my fault, and therefore I do not have to pay. It's an accident. I could not have foreseen that. Now, this itself is subject to a big machloket. So this makes sense according to the opinion that says, even though I was negligent at first, but in the end it ended up being an accident, so therefore patur. But there's another opinion that says, who says patur, that makes sense, but another opinion that says that if I was negligent at first, even though it ended up being an accident beyond my control, still I was negligent, and therefore I am liable no matter what. So I shouldn't have let it go up because I knew that it might jump. Even though it didn't jump and it fell, still I was negligent and shouldn't have let it go up, so therefore I'm still liable. According to that, how will you explain this case in the Braita and the inference from the Mishnah that when it falls, it's patur. Kegon de mekarbi kelim legabe kotel deki kafsi bekefisa la nefli alayhu vafilu tchilato b'shi'aleka. We're talking about a case where the vessels, your vessels, are very close to the wall, and therefore. And there's no vessels far away from the wall, and therefore I saw my dog climbing up, and I calculated the projectile momentum, and realized that if it jumps off the roof, it will clear your vessels. It'll jump far from the wall, and it will land on the ground without any problem. So therefore, I was not negligent allowing it to go up. I saw that it would clear your vessels. Now it went up, which is totally fine, and it slipped and fell, and so then when it falls, it goes directly down and lands close to the wall, which is where your vessels are. But that I was not negligent in letting it go up, because if it jumped, there would have been no injury. No damage. Amad of Zibin Mishme de Rava. Pamim shafilu naflu name hayav. Mashkachat la bekotel ra'ua. Zibin, in the name of Rava, says there are cases where even if it falls, I would still be liable. For example, if it's a rickety wall, so I shouldn't have let it go up at all. Whether it jumps or falls, I shouldn't have let it go up a wall that's not stable. Now, what's the case? What I should have anticipated that if it goes up on the wall, a brick is going to fall. But a brick didn't fall. The dog fell. So, okay, even if I was negligent in terms of letting it go up on a wall, that a brick could fall, and then if a brick would fall, I would be liable. But a brick didn't fall, so I was not. I shouldn't be liable to that. Rather, because that would be tchilato b'peshi'a v'sofo be'onesu. There, although I shouldn't have let it go up because I should have anticipated a brick would fall, but in the end, the brick didn't fall. The dog fell, so that was an accident. La siricha bechotel sar. Rather, what we mean, the case that Rava would apply to is if it's a narrow wall, very hard to balance on. I should have known if I let my dog go up there, either it'll jump and break something, or because it's so narrow, it's likely to slip and fall and break something. And therefore, no matter what happens to it, any way down is going to be something that I need to anticipate. And therefore, I should not have let it go up. And therefore, this is a case where I was negligent, and what happened at the end was a result of my negligence. I should have anticipated, and therefore one would be chayav. So yes, there are cases where even though it slipped and fell, it didn't mean it didn't jump. Still, it was likely to fall and slip, and I should have anticipated that. Tenur Banan. The dog and a goat, if they jump from down to up, that's unusual. They don't jump that way, and therefore, if they do that, it's just an accident. It's totally unexpected. So I don't have to pay, at least not the full amount, right? Is this like totally honest, or just mean like a short time? This is unusual behavior, and I don't have to pay the full amount. Either way, I don't have to pay the full amount. But if it jumps from high to low, then I'm liable, because that is typical behavior for it to do. And this would be, let's say it happens in your property, this would be a case of regel. Just like walking is normal, so too jumping from high to low is a normal thing, and I would have to pay the full amount. Adam betanegol shedildegu ben milma'ala ben lemata ben milmata lema'ala hayavin. On the other hand, a human or a chicken that jumps and breaks something, it doesn't matter whether it jumps up or down. These are normal behaviors, and one is liable. Humans are always liable for whatever they do. Question: Vatanya hakel v'hagedish shedilegu ben lema'ala lemata ben milamata lema'ala peturin. Hold on, we have a braita that contradicts what we just said, because here a dog or a goat that jumps, whether it goes from up to down or down to up, I am not liable. But we just said if it goes from up to down, I am liable. So which one is it? Tirgemara papa da pich mepach kalba bizkira vegadya bisricha. Rapapa explains that in this case, when the dog or the goat are jumping from up to down, even though normally they jump from up to down, but they're doing so in an unusual way. If a dog leaps down, it doesn't usually. Usually it climbs down carefully. If it leaps down, that's unusual. And a goat, usually it leaps down. Now, if it climbs down carefully, that's unusual for the goat to do. And so therefore, even though they're going from up to down, they're doing it in an unusual way. And now we ask, okay, even if it's unusual, why are they patur? They don't have to pay at all. This is not like it fell where it's an accident. It's still doing something and causing damage, even if it's an unusual way. Why should they not pay anything? And so we say, you're right. Patur min nezek shalem, chayvim min chasi nezek. He doesn't have to pay a full amount, but he has to pay chasi nezek, like goring, because he's doing something in an unusual way. In conclusion, we see that there are different levels and categories of damage. If it's something that the animal does normally, like walking or jumping, and it's in the shut hanizak, then I have to be careful to make sure my animal is not going to walk and trample over your grain, or is going to jump off of your roof and break your vessels, because that's normal behavior and it's expected. And if it does that in your property, I would have to pay a full amount. On the other hand, the opposite extreme, if it's a complete accident, right? It slipped and had no, didn't know, it wasn't trying to do that. Then, and I was not negligent. I didn't. I was watching it, and a total mistake happened. Then I don't have to pay anything at all, zero. On the other end, in between case, which would apply in the Shut HaNizak or in the Shut HaRabim, is if the animal causes damage with intent, but it's unusual for it to act that way, like goring. So this is unusual. And same thing with here, that if it's jumping down, but jumping down in an unusual fashion, that it doesn't normally act that way, but still it is doing something. It's not a complete accident, but it's unusual. Then there'll be a category of goring, and if it's a tam, then I would have to pay only half the amount of the damage. Baruch Adonai Leolam, Amen ve'Amen.